The pre-dawn chill of Astoria was a familiar ghost, a companion in the quiet hours when the city held its breath. For Henry Miller, it was the most honest part of the day. Outside, the world still wore a soft grey veil. Streetlights stretched long, lonely shadows beneath his small apartment. Inside the miller's hearth, warmth had already bloomed, thick with yeast, flour, and slow fermenting thyme. His broad hands, permanently dusted white, moved with a grace passed down through 3 generations over a scarred wooden table that remembered 1,000 loaves. Each fold and press felt like prayer. Here, ingredients were honest. They answered warmth and patience, never pretending. The proofing cabinet hummed its steady hymn while the city woke in the distance, the N train's first rumble. A sanitation truck's groan. But in here, time kept bread's pace. He wasn't just a baker, he was a custodian of a legacy, guarding simple truths in a world growing complicated and false. He shaped another boule, the dough sighing under his palms, and peace settled, until Blair surfaced in his mind like a cold splinter in the heat of his routine, reminding him the one ingredient he couldn't master was love. Her scent still lingered on the pillow upstairs. Expensive, intricate, jasmine-laced with something metallic, made for glass-walled boardrooms and rooftop bars in Soho, not a bakery apartment in Queens. Henry slid a tray of brioche into the deck oven, the heat washing his face, and tried to anchor himself in timing and temperature. But his thoughts kept climbing the stairs, into the curated life Blair lived through the glow of her phone. Hashtags, sponsored posts, staged brunches, borrowed designer clothes. In that world, he was the authentic prop, the wholesome baker boyfriend, rustic contrast for her influencer sheen. He saw it in the glaze of her eyes when he talked about fermentation, in her irritation when flour kissed her black leggings. And still he loved her, or the version of her he hoped lived beneath the filters and the hunger for status. Today was her birthday. He meant to cross the gap between their worlds with a gift that couldn't be staged. Something real, something him. It was history and devotion, and a secret he'd carried his entire life. Heavier than any sack of flour, he only prayed she would recognize its value, the kind that can't be counted in likes or followers. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe to see how the truth always finds its way to the surface. The object of his hope sat on the worn butcher block in the center of his small kitchen. It wasn't a sleek Fifth Avenue jewelry box, nor wrapped in anything showy. It was a simple dark wooden case, hand-carved by his grandfather from reclaimed walnut, smooth and cool, carrying a faint sweetness of brandy and spice absorbed over decades. Henry traced the dovetailed corners, feeling the seamless joinery of a time when things were built to outlive their owners. This wasn't packaging, it was a vessel of memory, a link to the man who taught him that the truest value often hides in plain sight. Inside, on a bed of plain linen, rested the gift itself, the family legacy fruitcake. The apartment was already saturated with its scent, a dense, intoxicating haze of aged spirits, dark molasses, and exotic spices that clung to the back of his throat. He'd spent the past week preparing it, following the faded, spidery script on his great-grandmother's recipe card. The ritual was slow and deliberate, each step insisting on the importance of what he was trying to do. Anxiety tightened in his chest as Blair's reactions surfaced in his mind. He knew how she wore that polite, strained smile for old-fashioned things, the one that never quite reached her eyes. He had rehearsed the story 100 times, the words that would turn this from a humble pastry into a key to their future. Yet staring at the unpretentious box, a cold dread seeped into him. The uneasy sense that some treasures are too heavy for those who only value what glitters on the surface. The fruitcake itself was an act of defiance against the modern world. Dense, dark, unapologetically heavy, the opposite of the light, airy, photogenic confections that populated Blair's feed. Its surface wasn't a canvas of pastel frostings or delicate sugarwork. It was a rugged, burnished landscape of deep mahogany, nearly black in the low light of his kitchen. To the uninitiated, it looked like a relic, a culinary fossil. Blair had once called his sourdough starter gross and dismissed his beloved rye as peasant food. What would she think of this? This was his family's heart, his heritage baked into a brandy-soaked loaf. The recipe was a secret, a cryptic map of flavor and patience. It demanded ingredients that were hard to find and harder to prepare. But the true secret, the one that made Henry's breath catch whenever he thought about it, was hidden among the candied fruits. They were scattered through the dark crumb, catching the light with a strange, deep glow. They weren't perfectly diced, artificially bright cubes from a store-bought tin. They were irregular and organic, unusually hard and heavy, each piece a dense knot of sweetness and history. To Henry, they were more precious than any diamond. They meant sacrifice, ingenuity, love stretched across generations. He had chosen this cake, this exact portion of the family legacy for her. It was his entire history, offered up in a form he prayed she'd have the patience to understand. He wasn't just giving her a cake. He was placing the keys to a kingdom she didn't know existed into her hands. Unimaginable security and freedom, disguised as a humble, embarrassing dessert. The grandfather clock in the corner of his living room, another inherited piece he refused to surrender, ticked with unnerving, deliberate slowness. Each tick-tock seemed to ricochet through the hollow space of his anxiety. 7:00 p.m. She was late. He had tidied the small apartment with meticulous care, a pointless attempt to make his world seem less simple, as she liked to call it. The worn armchair was disguised beneath a new throw. The stack of baking journals vanished from the coffee table, and a single, expensive-looking orchid stood awkwardly on the windowsill, an elegant impostor in a room that smelled of bread and old wood. He paced the scuffed floorboards above the muffled life of the bakery below. Usually the steady hum of refrigerators and the soft clank of cooling racks calmed him. Tonight, they barely touched the frantic fluttering in his chest. His eyes kept drifting to the wooden box on the table, its dark solidity a quiet rebuke. He'd rehearsed this moment for months. Let her settle, pour a glass of wine he couldn't really afford, then set the box in front of her and tell the story of a clever, resourceful great-grandfather who secured their future. Not just a cake, but a promise, a life without scraping and strain, a life where her ambitions wouldn't be chained to his modest income. "I can give you the world you want," he wanted to say, "but on our terms, real and true." In his head, the words sounded clumsy. The secret felt enormous, and the fear that she would see only the humble wrapping, not the treasure inside, tightened into a physical ache with every passing tick. Then a sound from the street below cut through the apartment's thin calm. A low, predatory growl. High performance, electric, utterly alien to a neighborhood of dented sedans and family minivans. He leaned toward the window and saw it. A gleaming, obsidian-black Porsche Taycan, its smooth lines too sleek for Astoria, like a spacecraft parked on the wrong planet. It pulsed under the streetlight's orange glow, a symbol of a world so distant it might as well have been Mars. The passenger door opened. A pair of impossibly thin, stiletto-heeled legs emerged, and then Blair, wrapped in a black dress that looked like liquid shadow, severe against the gritty sidewalk. Her heels struck the concrete with a sharp, aggressive click-clack, a sound that didn't belong here. It wasn't the relaxed arrival of someone coming home to celebrate. It was the sound of impatience, of purpose. He watched her buzz the intercom, posture rigid, her face lit by the cold blue glow of her phone. Nausea rose in him. This wasn't a birthday visit, it was an executive stepping into a hostile takeover. The air in the room seemed to thin, to cool, as if the bakery's warmth couldn't reach him anymore. He inhaled the rich, spiced aroma of the fruitcake, and it felt like a last, desperate prayer. Then he pressed the button to let her in, the electronic buzz loud as a warning, announcing a storm he wasn't ready to survive. She entered the apartment not with a hug or a smile, but with a gust of cold night air and the overwhelming scent of her perfume, which immediately overpowered the smell of his home. It was an invasion. Her eyes, cool and distant, did a quick, dismissive scan of the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on the new orchid, with a look that bordered on pity. "Henry," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth he so desperately needed to hear. There was no "happy to see you," no "sorry I'm late." He felt his carefully constructed evening begin to crumble before it had even begun. His rehearsed speech, the story of his great-grandfather, all of it felt foolish and naive in the face of her glacial presence. Still, he clung to the hope that his gift could change the atmosphere, that it could melt the ice in her eyes. "Happy birthday, Blair," he managed, his voice sounding thin and reedy to his own ears. "I have something for you, something special." He moved toward the table, his hands feeling clumsy and large. He picked up the wooden box, its familiar weight a small comfort. He held it out to her, an offering, a plea. It's from my family. It's a legacy." "Naig," he tried to imbue the word with all the significance it held for him, to convey the generations of love and history contained within the simple walnut frame. He saw her gaze drop to the box, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in a faint, almost imperceptible frown of confusion, or perhaps disdain. He began to open his mouth to tell the story, to explain everything, but he never got the chance. "I can't do this anymore, Henry." The words were quiet, delivered with a sigh of profound exhaustion, as if he were a tiresome task she had finally decided to abandon. They landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow, sucking all the air from his lungs. His hands, still holding the box, began to tremble. The story of his great-grandfather died on his lips, turning to ash in his mouth. He could only stare at her, trying to process the sudden, brutal shift in reality. Her face, usually a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality for her online audience, was now stripped bare, revealing a raw, undisguised impatience. The cool, appraising look she gave him was one he had seen her use on incompetent waiters or uncooperative Uber drivers. It was a look of pure, unadulterated dismissal. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold wave of shock washing over him, leaving him numb and hollow. "Do what?" he whispered, the question feeling utterly stupid as soon as it left his lips. He knew what. This life. His life. The small apartment, the smell of flour on his clothes, the quiet, unglamorous dignity of his work. It was all an elaborate, folksy stage prop for her, and she was done with the performance. The rich, spicy scent of the fruitcake suddenly seemed cloying and oppressive, the smell of his own foolish, misplaced love. He had been about to offer her a kingdom, and she hadn't even let him point to the map. "I've been seeing someone," she continued, the words clinical and precise, each one a perfectly sharpened blade sliding between his ribs. "His name is Preston. He's a venture capitalist." She said the title like an incantation, a magic phrase that explained and excused everything. "I met him at a gallery opening in Soho a few months ago." A few months. The timeline slammed into him. He thought of all the times she'd been distant, all the work dinners and networking events. He had naively believed her, chalking it up to her ambition, the relentless hustle of her influencer world. The truth was so much simpler, so much more humiliating. He had been the comfortable, convenient placeholder while she actively hunted for his replacement. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, a visceral, burning sensation. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the curated image. He saw a desperate, crippling anxiety in her eyes, a terror of being ordinary. He was the embodiment of that terror. He was the before picture she was desperate to escape. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its relentless ticking, each second marking another piece of their shared history turning into a lie. He could hear the faint hum of the Porsche's engine outside, a waiting chariot ready to spirit her away from this life of raisins and back to a world of diamonds. The box in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a sarcophagus containing not just a cake, but all his dead and foolish hopes. With a look of profound distaste, she gestured toward the box he was still holding. Her gaze swept over the hand-carved wood, the history it represented, and saw nothing. Her focus was on the humble object within, the symbol of everything she was rejecting. "I want a real life, Henry," she said, her voice laced with a cold, clear disdain that was more painful than any shout. "I want to go to Monaco, not Coney Island. I want to wear Chanel, not your flour-dusted apron. I want diamonds, not raisins." The word hung in the air between them, small, shriveled, and worthless. It was the ultimate dismissal, a reduction of his entire family legacy, his profoundest expression of love, to a cheap, common pantry item. She pushed the box away with the tips of her fingers, a gesture of such casual contempt that it made him physically flinch. The box slid a few inches across the table, the sound of wood on wood unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. "We're done." And with that, she turned. She didn't look back. He watched her walk to the door, her movements crisp and efficient, like a surgeon finishing a clean, precise amputation. The click of the door latch was the final, definitive sound. He heard her sharp, confident footsteps descending the stairs, then the soft, expensive thud of a Porsche door closing. The low hum of the electric engine swelled and then faded into the distance, leaving behind only the ticking of the clock and the crushing, absolute silence of his empty apartment. He was left alone, standing in the ruins of his life, with $50 million in a fruitcake that had just been compared to a handful of raisins. The silence that followed her departure was a physical presence. It was heavier than the humid summer air, denser than the darkest rye dough. It pressed in on Henry from all sides, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. The ticking of the grandfather clock, once a comforting heartbeat in his home, now sounded like a merciless countdown to a future he couldn't comprehend. His gaze was fixed on the wooden box sitting on the table. It looked alien now, an artifact from a life that had ended just moments ago. The rich, spicy aroma of the fruitcake, which had filled him with such hope and anticipation, now smelled like failure. It was the scent of his own naivety, his own blindness. He reached out a trembling hand and traced the carved initials of his grandfather, a man who had understood the world in a way Henry clearly did not. He had thought love and legacy were currencies that mattered. He had believed that a gift of the heart, a gift of history and security, would be worth more than the fleeting glamour of a venture capitalist's lifestyle. He had been a fool. The word echoed in the silent room. Fool, fool, fool. He sank into a chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He stared at the box, the rejected treasure, the symbol of his utter and complete misjudgment of the woman he thought he knew. The city outside hummed with life, with people moving toward their futures, but his own future had just been amputated, leaving him bleeding out in the quiet of his small apartment, with nothing but a worthless cake for company. The days that followed were a blur of grey monotony. The sun would rise, casting its pale light into his flour-dusted world, but it brought no warmth. The bakery, once his sanctuary, became his prison. The familiar rituals of his craft, the kneading and shaping and baking, which had always centered him, now felt like hollow, meaningless motions. The dough felt inert and lifeless in his hands, refusing to respond to his touch. It was as if his own despair had been baked into every loaf. His loyal customers in Astoria, the ones who had known him since he was a boy, noticed the change. They saw the new hollowness in his eyes, the slight stoop in his shoulders. They would offer quiet words of concern, their kindness a small, painful reminder of a community he felt increasingly disconnected from. He would force a weak smile, murmur something about being tired, and retreat into the steamy solitude of the back room. At night, he would sit in his silent apartment, the wooden box containing the fruitcake still on the table, a constant, mocking presence. He couldn't bring himself to open it, and he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was a monument to his humiliation. He saw Blair everywhere, in the flash of a passing expensive car, in the face of a young woman scrolling through her phone with a look of bored dissatisfaction, in the scent of a stranger's perfume on the subway. Each sighting was a fresh twist of the knife, a reminder of what he had lost, or perhaps what he had never truly had. His passion, the very engine of his life, had stalled, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief and regret. Weeks bled into a month. The fruitcake sat on the table, a dark, silent sentinel. The linen it rested on was gathering a fine layer of dust. Several times, Henry had walked over to it with the intention of finally ending the charade. He would take it downstairs, wrap it in newspaper, and bury it at the bottom of the dumpster in the alley behind the bakery. Let the raccoons and the rats have it. It was what it deserved. It was what he deserved for being so blind. One Tuesday night, the bakery quiet and the city outside hushed by a steady drizzle, he decided this would be the night. He was filled with a bitter, cleansing resolve. He walked to the table, his movements heavy and deliberate. He lifted the lid of the wooden box, the hinges making a soft, mournful creak. The concentrated aroma of brandy and spice billowed out, weaker now but still potent, still thick with memory and failure. He stared down at the dark, dense cake. He was about to slam the lid shut to carry the whole damned thing to its ignominious end, when a flicker of light caught his eye. It was one of the candied fruits near the surface, glinting in the dim lamplight from the living room. For a split second, it didn't look like a piece of fruit at all. It shone with a deep, internal fire, a flash of crimson that seemed impossibly vivid. A memory, distant and hazy, surfaced in his mind. His grandfather, sitting in this very apartment, holding one of the fruits up to the light. He remembered the old man's words, spoken in a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Never judge a treasure by its wrapping, son. The sweetest fruit is often the hardest to crack." That single, glinting memory was a key, turning a lock in his mind. The phrase, "the hardest to crack," echoed with new meaning. He reached into the box, and his fingers closed around one of the odd, heavy fruits. It was cool to the touch and unnervingly hard, with sharp, crystalline edges. It felt nothing like preserved fruit. It felt like a rock. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. He carried the small, dark object over to the window, holding it up to the streetlight's glow. The crimson light trapped within it seemed to pulse, a deep, pigeon blood red that was mesmerizing. He thought of his great-grandfather, the quiet, unassuming man who had left the family this strange legacy. He was a prospector, the family stories said, a man who had spent his life pulling secrets from the earth. What if the secret wasn't the recipe? What if the recipe was just the camouflage? With a trembling hand, he took the object and dragged its sharp edge across the glass of the window pane. It didn't skid or crumble. It bit into the glass, leaving a clean, deep scratch in its wake. A gasp escaped his lips. He stumbled back from the window, his mind reeling, the small, hard object feeling like a burning coal in his palm. It wasn't candied fruit. It was never candied fruit. His grandfather's words came back to him, no longer a folksy aphorism, but a literal, earth-shattering instruction. He had been guarding a treasure chest his entire life, and he had just tried to hand the key to a woman who thought it was a raisin. The next morning, Henry was a man possessed by a singular, electrifying purpose. The fog of grief had been burned away, replaced by the white-hot fire of revelation. He carefully extracted a half-dozen more of the fruits. The pre-dawn chill of Astoria was a familiar ghost, a constant companion in the quiet hours when the city held its breath. For Henry Miller, this was the most honest part of the day. The world outside was still draped in the soft grey veil of near morning, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows on the pavement below his small apartment. But inside the miller's hearth, life had already begun. The air was thick and warm, pregnant with the holy trinity of his craft: yeast, flour, and slow fermenting time. His hands, broad and dusted with a permanent layer of white, moved with an unconscious grace, a muscle memory passed down through 3 generations. He worked the dough on the large, worn wooden table, its surface scarred with the history of 1,000 loaves. Each fold, each press, each turn was a prayer. This was his sanctuary, a world he understood completely. Here, ingredients were honest. They responded to warmth, to patience, to a firm but gentle hand. They did not lie or pretend. The low hum of the proofing cabinet was the only music he needed, a steady, reliable drone against the silence. He could feel the city waking up around him, the first distant rumble of the N train, the groan of a sanitation truck. But in here, time moved at the pace of rising bread. He was not just a baker, he was a custodian of a legacy, a keeper of simple, profound truths in a world that seemed increasingly complicated and false. He shaped another boule, the dough sighing softly under his palms, and for a moment, a perfect, untroubled peace settled over him. It was a peace that lasted only until the thought of her, of Blair, inevitably crept in, a sharp, cold splinter in the warm comfort of his routine, reminding him that the most important ingredient in his life was the one he could never seem to get right. The scent of her was still on the pillow upstairs, a complex and expensive fragrance that always seemed at war with the honest, earthy smells of his life. It was a ghost of jasmine and something colder, more metallic, a perfume designed for glass-walled boardrooms and rooftop bars in Soho, not a small apartment above a bakery in Queens. Henry slid a tray of glistening brioche into the cavernous mouth of the deck oven, the wave of heat a familiar caress on his face. He tried to focus on the work, on the precise timing and temperature that his craft demanded, but his mind kept drifting upstairs to the carefully curated life Blair lived through the small, glowing screen of her phone. Her world was one of hashtags and sponsored posts, of meticulously staged brunches and borrowed designer clothes. He was the wholesome accessory, the authentic baker boyfriend, who provided a useful, rustic contrast to her aspiring influencer aesthetic. He knew this, on some level. He saw the way her eyes would glaze over when he spoke about fermentation times or the specific grain profile of a new shipment of rye. He saw the flicker of annoyance when flour from his apron accidentally dusted her black leggings. And yet, he loved her. He loved the idea of her, at least, the vibrant, ambitious woman he believed existed beneath the layers of filters and status anxiety. Today was her birthday, and he was determined to bridge the chasm between their worlds with a gift that was more him, more real, than anything she could ever post on her Instagram feed. It was a gift of history, of love, of a secret he had guarded his entire life, and the weight of it felt heavier than any sack of flour. He just prayed she would understand its value, a value that couldn't be measured in likes or followers. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. The object of his hope sat on the worn butcher block in the center of his small kitchen. It wasn't a sleek, minimalist box from a Fifth Avenue jeweler, nor was it wrapped in ostentatious paper. It was a simple, dark wooden box, hand-carved by his own grandfather from a piece of reclaimed walnut. The wood was smooth and cool to the touch, its surface bearing the faint, sweet scent of the brandies and spices it had absorbed over decades. Henry ran his fingers over the intricate, dovetailed corners, feeling the seamless joinery that spoke of a time when things were made to last forever. This box was a vessel of memory, a tangible link to the man who had taught him that the truest value is often hidden from plain sight. Inside, nestled on a bed of simple linen, was the gift itself, the family legacy fruitcake. The air in the small apartment was already thick with its aroma, a dense, intoxicating cloud of aged spirits, dark molasses, and exotic spices that clung to the back of his throat. He had spent the last week preparing it, following the faded, spidery script of his great-grandmother's recipe card. It was a ritual, a meditation. The process was slow, deliberate, each step a testament to the importance of what he was doing. He felt a tremor of anxiety in his chest, a familiar tightening whenever he thought of Blair's reaction. He knew how she felt about old-fashioned things. He could already picture the polite, strained smile she would adopt, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. He had rehearsed the words 100 times in his mind, the story he would tell her that would unlock the cake's true meaning, transforming it from a simple pastry into a key to their future. But as he looked at the humble, unpretentious box, a cold dread began to seep into his heart. A premonition that some treasures are too heavy for those who only value what glitters on the surface. The fruitcake itself was an act of defiance against the modern world. It was unapologetically dense, dark, and heavy, the antithesis of the light, airy, photogenic confections that populated Blair's Instagram feed. Its surface was not a canvas of pastel frostings or delicate sugarwork. It was a rugged, burnished landscape of deep mahogany, almost black in the low light of his kitchen. To the uninitiated, it looked like a relic from a forgotten time, a culinary fossil. Blair had once called his sourdough starter gross and referred to his beloved rye bread as peasant food. What would she think of this? This was the heart of his family, the soul of his heritage, baked into a dense, brandy-soaked loaf. The recipe was a secret, a cryptic map of flavors and textures. It called for ingredients that were hard to find and even harder to prepare. But the true secret, the one that made Henry's breath catch in his throat every time he thought about it, was hidden within the candied fruits. They were scattered throughout the dark crumb, catching the light with a strange, deep luminescence. They were unusually hard, their shapes irregular and organic, nothing like the perfectly diced, artificially colored fruits one found in commercial cakes. They were heavy, each one a small, dense node of sweetness and history. To Henry, they were the most beautiful things in the world, more precious than any diamond. They represented sacrifice, ingenuity, and a love that spanned generations. He had chosen this specific cake, this specific portion of the family legacy, for her. It was his entire heart, his entire history, offered up in a form he prayed she would have the patience to understand. He was not just giving her a cake, he was giving her the keys to a kingdom she didn't even know existed, a future of unimaginable security and freedom, all disguised as a humble, embarrassing dessert. The grandfather clock in the corner of his living room, another inherited piece he refused to part with, ticked with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. Each tick-tock seemed to echo in the cavernous space of his anxiety. 7:00 p.m. She was late. He had tidied the small apartment meticulously, a futile effort to make his world seem less simple, as she so often called it. He had hidden the worn-out armchair under a new throw blanket, tucked away the stack of baking journals that usually lived on his coffee table, and even bought a single, expensive-looking orchid that now stood awkwardly on his windowsill. A floral imposter in a room that smelled of bread and old wood. He paced the worn floorboards, his footsteps muffled by the rumbling life of the bakery below. The sounds were a comfort. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerators and the gentle clanking of cooling racks. But tonight they did little to soothe the frantic fluttering in his chest. He kept glancing at the wooden box on the table, its dark, solid presence, a silent rebuke to his nervousness. He had imagined this moment for months. He would let her settle in, pour her a glass of the good wine he couldn't really afford, and then he would present the box. He would tell her the story of his great-grandfather, the clever, resourceful prospector who found a way to secure his family's future. He would explain that this wasn't just a cake, it was a promise of a life without financial struggle, a life where her ambitions wouldn't be shackled by his modest income. It was his way of saying, "I can give you the world you want, but on our own terms, with something real and true." The words felt clumsy and inadequate in his mind. The weight of the secret was immense, and the fear that she would see only the humble wrapping and not the treasure within was a physical ache, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach with every passing, ticking second. A sound from the street below sliced through the quiet hum of his apartment, a low, predatory growl completely alien to his neighborhood of dented sedans and family minivans. It was the sound of a high-performance electric motor, silent yet menacing, a noise that spoke of wealth and effortless power. Henry moved to the window, his heart beginning a low, anxious thrum against his ribs. He peered through the old, wavy glass and saw it, a gleaming, obsidian-black Porsche Taycan, its smooth, aerodynamic lines looking like a spaceship that had landed on the wrong planet. It pulsed silently under the orange glow of the streetlight, a symbol of a world so far removed from his own it might as well have been on Mars. Then the passenger door swung open with a futuristic, whisper-quiet hiss. A pair of impossibly thin, stiletto-heeled legs emerged, followed by the rest of Blair. She was wearing a black dress that seemed to be made of liquid shadow, a stark, severe silhouette against the gritty backdrop of Astoria. The click-clack of her heels on the worn concrete sidewalk was sharp and aggressive, a sound that didn't belong here. It was the sound of impatience, of purpose. He watched her buzz the intercom, her posture rigid, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of her phone. A wave of nausea washed over him, a sour, acidic feeling in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the relaxed, happy arrival of a woman coming to celebrate her birthday with the man she loved. This was an executive arriving for a hostile takeover. The air in the room suddenly felt thin and cold, the comforting warmth from the bakery downstairs unable to reach him. He took a deep breath, the rich, spicy aroma of the fruitcake filling his lungs, and it felt like a final, desperate prayer before an execution. He pressed the button to let her in, the electronic buzz sounding like a warning siren, signaling the arrival of a storm he was completely unprepared to weather. She entered the apartment not with a hug or a smile, but with a gust of cold night air and the overwhelming scent of her perfume, which immediately overpowered the smell of his home. It was an invasion, a chemical colonization of his space. The fragrance was sharp and complex, notes of jasmine and something metallic, a scent designed for sterile art galleries and members-only clubs, and it declared war on the honest, warm smells of yeast and baking spices that defined his life. Her eyes, cool and distant, did a quick, dismissive scan of the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on the new orchid with a look that bordered on pity, as if it were a pathetic attempt to mimic her world of effortless elegance. "Henry," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth he so desperately needed to hear. There was no "happy to see you," no "sorry I'm late." He felt his carefully constructed evening begin to crumble before it had even begun, the foundations turning to sand. His rehearsed speech, the beautiful story of his great-grandfather and the hidden legacy, all of it felt foolish and naive in the face of her glacial presence. Still, he clung to the hope that his gift could change the atmosphere, that its tangible history could melt the ice in her eyes. "Happy birthday, Blair," he managed, his voice sounding thin and reedy to his own ears. "I have something for you, something special." He moved toward the table, his hands feeling clumsy and large. The baker's hands that suddenly seemed crude and unsophisticated. He picked up the wooden box, its familiar weight a small comfort against the rising panic. He held it out to her, an offering, a plea. It's from my family. It's a legacy. He tried to imbue the word with all the significance it held for him, to convey the generations of love and history contained within the simple walnut frame. He saw her gaze drop to the box, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in a faint, almost imperceptible frown of confusion, or perhaps pure disdain. "I can't do this anymore, Henry." The words were quiet, delivered with a sigh of profound exhaustion. As if he were a tiresome task she had finally decided to abandon. They landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow, sucking all the air from his lungs. His hands, still holding the wooden box, began to tremble. The story of his great-grandfather died on his lips, turning to ash in his mouth. He could only stare at her, his mind struggling to process the sudden, brutal shift in reality. Her face, usually a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality for her online audience, was now stripped bare, revealing a raw, undisguised impatience. The cool, appraising look she gave him was one he had seen her use on incompetent waiters or uncooperative Uber drivers. It was a look of pure, unadulterated dismissal, an assessment of his value that had come back negative. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold wave of shock washing over him, leaving him numb and hollow. "Do what?" he whispered, the question feeling utterly stupid as soon as it left his lips. He knew what. This life, his life. The small apartment, the smell of flour on his clothes, the quiet, unglamorous dignity of his work. It was all an elaborate, folksy stage prop for her, and she was done with the performance. The rich, spicy scent of the fruitcake suddenly seemed cloying and oppressive, the smell of his own foolish, misplaced love. He had been about to offer her a kingdom, and she hadn't even let him point to the map, a map she had no intention of ever reading. "I've been seeing someone," she continued, the words clinical and precise, each one a perfectly sharpened blade sliding between his ribs. "His name is Preston. He's a venture capitalist." She said the title like an incantation, a magic phrase that explained and excused everything, a password to a world he couldn't enter. "I met him at a gallery opening in Soho a few months ago." A few months. The timeline slammed into him with the force of a physical impact. He thought of all the times she'd been distant, all the work dinners and networking events that had filled her calendar. He had naively believed her, chalking it up to her ambition, the relentless hustle of her influencer world. The truth was so much simpler, so much more humiliating. He had been the comfortable, convenient placeholder, the wholesome background character, while she actively auditioned for his replacement. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, a visceral burning sensation that made his skin prickle. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw past the curated image. He saw a desperate, crippling anxiety in her eyes, a terror of being ordinary, a fear of ending up in a place like this with a man like him. He was the embodiment of that terror. He was the before picture she was desperate to escape. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its relentless ticking, each second marking another piece of their shared history, turning into a lie. He could hear the faint hum of the Porsche's engine outside, a waiting chariot ready to spirit her away from this life of simple truths and back to a world of complicated, expensive lies, a world where a man's worth was measured by his portfolio, not his character. With a look of profound distaste, she gestured toward the box he was still holding, his hands frozen in the act of offering. Her gaze swept over the hand-carved wood, the history it represented, and saw nothing but old, worthless timber. Her focus was on the humble object within, the symbol of everything she was rejecting. "I want a real life, Henry," she said, her voice laced with a cold, clear disdain that was more painful than any shout. "I want to go to Monaco, not Coney Island. I want to wear Chanel, not your flour-dusted apron. I want diamonds, not raisins." The word hung in the air between them, small, shriveled, and worthless. It was the ultimate dismissal, a reduction of his entire family legacy, his profoundest expression of love, to a cheap, common pantry item. She pushed the box away with the tips of her fingers, a gesture of such casual contempt that it made him physically flinch, as if she had struck him. The box slid a few inches across the table, the sound of wood on wood unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. "We're done." And with that, she turned. She didn't look back. He watched her walk to the door, her movements crisp and efficient, like a surgeon finishing a clean, precise amputation. The click of the door latch was the final, definitive sound. He heard her sharp and confident footsteps descending the stairs, then the soft, expensive thud of a Porsche door closing. The low hum of the electric engine swelled and then faded into the distance, leaving behind only the ticking of the clock and the crushing, absolute silence of his empty apartment. He was left alone, standing in the ruins of his life, with $50 million in a fruitcake that had just been despised as a handful of raisins. The silence that followed her departure was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered all other sounds. It was heavier than the humid summer air, denser than the darkest rye dough. It pressed in on Henry from all sides, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. The ticking of the grandfather clock, once a comforting heartbeat in his home, now sounded like a merciless countdown to a future he couldn't comprehend. Each tick, a tiny hammer blow against his sanity. His gaze was fixed on the wooden box sitting on the table, its dark, hand-carved surface, a stark contrast to the cheap laminate. It looked alien now, an artifact from a life that had ended just moments ago. The rich, spicy aroma of the fruitcake, which had filled him with such hope and anticipation, now smelled like failure. It was the scent of his own naivety, his own blindness. He reached out a trembling hand and traced the carved initials of his grandfather, a man who had understood the world in a way Henry clearly did not. He had thought love and legacy were currencies that mattered. He had believed that a gift of the heart, a gift of history and security, would be worth more than the fleeting glamour of a venture capitalist's lifestyle. He had been a fool. The word echoed in the silent room. Fool, fool, fool. He sank into a chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He stared at the box, the rejected treasure, the symbol of his utter and complete misjudgment. Then his eyes drifted to the corner of the room, to the sleek, silver MacBook Air she had left on his small desk in her haste to depart, a gleaming piece of her world left behind in his. A cold, unfamiliar thought began to crystallize in the fog of his grief. Her departure hadn't felt like a heartbroken goodbye. It felt like a business transaction, and he was suddenly desperate to see the receipts. He approached the laptop as if it were a venomous snake. Its cold aluminum shell was smooth beneath his fingertips, a stark contrast to the warm, living dough he was used to handling. The surface was smudged with her fingerprints, ghostly traces of the woman he thought he knew. For a moment, he hesitated, a wave of guilt washing over him. This was a violation, a trespass into a private world. But the clinical cruelty of her words, the final dismissive flick of her fingers against his family's legacy, had cauterized that part of him. He was no longer a lover seeking closure. He was a victim investigating a crime scene. He lifted the lid. The screen flickered to life, illuminating his face with its cold blue light. The desktop background was a photo he'd never seen, Blair and a handsome, sharp-jawed man in a tailored suit, clinking champagne flutes on a rooftop, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind them like a pile of diamonds. Preston. The sight was a fresh, sharp pain, but it also hardened his resolve. The machine was password protected. He typed in their anniversary date, access denied. He tried the name of the bakery, access denied. A bitter smile touched his lips. Of course, his world was no longer her password. He thought for a moment, trying to inhabit her mind, her aspirations. He typed Preston and Blair 2024. Access denied. He tried one more time, thinking of the world she craved, the status she worshipped. He typed Soho Legacy 7, The screen unlocked. The inbox loaded, a dizzying cascade of emails from PR firms, clothing brands, and social media notifications. He ignored them all, his eyes scanning the sender list, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, until he found what he was looking for, a recurring thread with a law firm, a name synonymous with aggressive corporate litigation. His hand trembled as he clicked open the email chain. The subject line was chillingly innocuous. Project Hearthstone, due diligence. He scrolled down, his eyes struggling to make sense of the dense paragraphs of legalese. This wasn't about a breakup. This was about a hostile takeover. He saw his life, his identity, dissected in cold corporate terms. The Miller's Hearth was referred to not as a home or a legacy, but as an underperforming legacy asset with significant branding potential. They discussed the authenticity narrative of his family's history as if it were a commodity to be packaged and sold. He saw emails between Blair and a lawyer named Marcus Thorne, where she provided detailed information about the bakery's finances, its daily earnings, its seasonal lulls, information she could only have known from living with him, from pillow talk he had mistaken for intimacy. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if he'd been living with a corporate spy. They had been assessing him, running the numbers on his life while he was baking bread for her breakfast. He was not a partner, he was a target. The love and trust he had given her so freely had been weaponized, used as intelligence to map out the vulnerabilities of his small kingdom. He kept scrolling, his breath catching in his throat as he saw an email from Preston to the lawyer, dated 2 weeks ago, with a single damning attachment that laid the entire plan bare. He clicked on the attachment, a PDF file that took a moment to load, a moment in which Henry felt the last vestiges of his grief being burned away by a white-hot, clarifying rage. The document was a formal investment proposal from Preston's venture capital firm. He read it, his baker's hands, accustomed to the honest weight of flour and water, now tracing the predatory clauses of a contract designed to strip him of everything he held dear. The proposal offered a lifeline investment of $100,000 in exchange for a 75% controlling interest in the Miller's Hearth. It stipulated that the property deed for the building, which his family had owned outright for nearly a century, would be signed over to a newly formed shell company as collateral. The contract also granted the new parent company irrevocable and perpetual rights to all proprietary recipes, branding, and family narratives. They weren't just trying to buy his bakery, they were trying to buy his name, his history, his soul, for pennies on the dollar. The most sickening part was the track changes and comments along the margin. They were from Blair. "He's very sentimental about his grandfather," one comment read. "We can frame the deed transfer as a way to protect the legacy." Another said, "He's always stressed about money. Position the 100K as a way for him to finally breathe. He'll be grateful." He was reading the blueprint for his own financial execution, and it was co-authored by the woman he loved. Numbly, he clicked back to the email browser, his mind a maelstrom of betrayal and fury. He used the search bar, typing in his own name. A new folder, previously hidden, appeared. It was titled HM Financials. His blood ran cold. He opened it. Inside was a complete and unauthorized forensic accounting of his life. There were copies of his bakery's profit and loss statements from the past 3 years, a detailed analysis of his business credit, and even a recent property appraisal for his building. They had been digging into every corner of his existence, assessing his worth down to the last cent. He felt stripped bare, his financial privacy violated in the most profound way. Then he saw the final email, the one that broke everything. It was from Preston to Blair, sent just last night. "The due diligence is complete," it read. "The asset itself is small, but the authenticity narrative is marketable. If you can get him to sign over the deed for the low 6-figure investment, we can flip the property and license the brand. The baker himself is irrelevant." Irrelevant. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. All his work, his passion, his heritage. He was just a disposable component in their plan. The sadness was gone, incinerated. In its place was a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He slowly closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the silent room. His gaze fell upon the wooden box on the table, the rejected fruitcake sitting within. He looked at the $50 million treasure they had dismissed as raisins, and then back at the laptop containing the proof of their pathetic $100,000 scheme. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Henry's face for the first time in weeks. They thought he was irrelevant, but he was about to become the single most relevant fact of their entire lives. The first light of dawn was beginning to paint the edges of the Astoria skyline in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, but Henry didn't see it. The world outside his window had ceased to exist. His universe had collapsed to the dimensions of the small, silent apartment and the cold, hard truth contained within the laptop on his desk. The rage that had incinerated his grief was now cooling, hardening into something far more dangerous, a calm, crystalline purpose. He stood up, his movements no longer heavy with sadness, but imbued with a new, unsettling precision. He walked to the kitchen and carefully, almost reverently, lifted the fruitcake from its wooden box. He wrapped it in several layers of parchment paper, then plastic wrap, his hands moving with the methodical care of a man handling an unexploded bomb. He placed the wrapped cake back into the box and latched it shut. Next, he turned his attention to the laptop. He didn't wipe it or try to hide his tracks. The evidence was the point. He closed the lid, unplugged it, and slid it into an old canvas backpack he hadn't used in years, a bag that smelled faintly of camping trips and a life before Blair. He then walked to his bedroom closet, past the flour-dusted work clothes that defined his life, and reached into the very back. His fingers found the heavy wool of a suit bag. He hadn't worn the suit since his grandfather's funeral 5 years ago. It was dark charcoal, simple, and well-made. As he put it on, the fabric felt foreign against his skin, a constricting armor. He looked at his reflection in the dusty closet mirror. The man looking back was a stranger. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes held a glint of cold fire that was entirely new. He was no longer Henry Miller, the simple baker. He was the custodian of a $50 million secret and the architect of a revenge so meticulous it would be a work of art. He picked up the backpack and the wooden box, walked out of his apartment, and locked the door behind him, knowing he would never see this life in the same way again, because he was not heading to the bakery below, but to a private bank in Midtown Manhattan that his grandfather had told him about in a hushed whisper years ago, a place that didn't exist for people like him unless they had a secret worth keeping. The journey from Queens to Manhattan felt like crossing an international border into a hostile foreign country. The familiar rumble of the N train, usually a comforting rhythm of his daily life, now sounded like a war drum beating a path toward confrontation. He emerged from the subway at 57th and 5th, the heart of Billionaires Row, and the air itself felt different. It was thinner, cleaner, smelling not of exhaust and street food, but of money and an indifferent kind of power. Henry, carrying his grandfather's worn wooden box and a dusty backpack, was an immediate anomaly amidst the sea of tailored suits and designer handbags. He could feel the dismissive glances of passers-by, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the scenery, a piece of urban grit that didn't belong. He ignored them, his focus locked on a discreet limestone building with no sign, only a small, polished brass number. He pushed through the heavy glass doors into a lobby of cavernous silence, all cool marble and dark, polished wood. A single security guard with an earpiece watched him approach the reception desk, his posture radiating suspicion. Henry didn't flinch. He gave his name and another, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "I have a standing appointment. My name is Henry Miller. I'm here to see Mr. Albright about the Miller Trust." The receptionist's polite, impenetrable mask flickered for a fraction of a second. She typed something into her computer, her eyes widening slightly before she composed herself. "Of course, Mr. Miller. Mr. Albright is expecting you." He was led to a silent, wood-paneled office overlooking Central Park. An elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes rose to greet him. This was Albright, his family's private banker, a living link to his grandfather's world. After the briefest of pleasantries, Henry placed the wooden box on the vast mahogany desk and opened it. He reached inside, passed the cake, and retrieved a small velvet pouch. He emptied its contents onto the desk. A single uncut ruby, the size of a robin's egg, pulsed with a deep internal fire, drinking the light of the office and casting a blood-red glow on the polished wood. Albright stared at it, his breath catching in his throat, before he looked up at Henry, his professional composure gone, replaced by something akin to awe, and whispered, "My God, son, where have the others been all this time?" Mr. Albright moved with a speed and decisiveness that belied his age. He picked up a secure internal phone line, his voice a low, urgent command. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the day, all of it. We have a Miller Legacy event in progress." Within minutes, the quiet office was a hub of controlled, high-level activity. A gemologist was summoned from the Diamond District, a quiet man who arrived with a locked metal briefcase and handled the ruby with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic. While the stone was being authenticated in an adjacent room, Albright guided Henry through a dizzying maze of financial architecture. The words and concepts came at him fast: shell company, irrevocable trust, asset protection. But Henry found his mind was unnaturally clear, absorbing the information not as a confused baker, but as a general studying a battlefield map. He was creating a fortress, a series of legal and financial walls around his inheritance that would be utterly impenetrable. Albright explained that his great-grandfather had established the initial trust with a handful of the first stones he found, creating a legal entity that had been lying dormant, quietly accumulating value for decades. Now they were going to activate it, funding it with the full weight of the discovery. Henry sat at the enormous mahogany desk, the scent of lemon oil and old money filling his nostrils, signing documents that shimmered with incomprehensible numbers. Each stroke of the pen felt like a betrayal of his simple life, but a necessary one. He was building a bunker to protect his family's history from predators like Preston and Blair. The gemologist returned, his face pale. "It's Burmese, pigeon's blood, completely untreated," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "In its raw state, this single stone is worth 8 figures, conservatively." Albright simply nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. He turned to Henry, the stack of newly signed documents between them. "The fortune is secure, Henry. It is now legally invisible and untouchable. They can't find it, and they can't take it. Now, tell me exactly what these people tried to do to you." Henry laid the story out with cold, dispassionate clarity. He explained Blair's calculated deception, Preston's predatory business plan, and the ultimate insulting dismissal of his legacy as raisins. He didn't speak with the pain of a jilted lover, but with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. He slid the canvas backpack onto the desk, took out Blair's MacBook Air, and opened it. He navigated directly to the emails, the investment proposal, the forensic accounting of his life. Albright read everything in silence, his expression hardening from concern to a quiet, controlled fury. The air in the room grew colder, the view of Central Park seeming to freeze over. When he was finished, Albright leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled. He was no longer just a banker. He was a guardian, an old-world conciliaire whose loyalty was to the family, not just the money. "This wasn't a breakup, Henry," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This was attempted grand larceny, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a flagrant breach of fiduciary trust. They didn't just want to take your bakery, they wanted to erase you." He paused, his sharp eyes locking onto Henry's. You cannot fight wolves with the tactics of a sheep. You need a wolf of your own, a bigger one. He picked up a pen and wrote a name and an address on a thick, cream-colored business card. Cyrus Thorne. He is the most ruthless corporate litigator in New York. He doesn't just win cases. He salts the earth so his enemies' careers can never grow again. He is obscenely expensive, and he only takes clients he finds. Interesting. Albright slid the card across the desk. Go and see him now. Tell him I sent you, and show him exactly what you showed me. This is no longer about protecting your assets. It's about systematically dismantling theirs. Cyrus Thorne's office was not what Henry had expected. It wasn't a glass-walled palace on the 80th floor. It was a set of chambers in a historic brownstone in the West Village, filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the air thick with the scent of old leather, paper, and expensive whiskey. Thorne himself was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a tweed jacket that seemed at odds with his reputation as a legal predator. But his eyes, behind a pair of antique reading glasses, were like chips of ice. They missed nothing. Henry sat across a massive oak desk as Thorne reviewed the contents of the laptop, his face an unreadable mask. He read every email, every clause of the investment proposal, and every demeaning comment Blair had made in the margins. Henry watched him, his own heart beating a steady, cold rhythm. He felt no fear, only a chilling sense of inevitability. When Thorne was finished, he closed the laptop gently and looked at Henry for a long, silent minute, an unnerving appraisal that felt like being weighed and measured on a soul scale. They see you as a baker, Thorne said, his voice a gravelly baritone, a simple, sentimental man easily parted from his ancestral home. They believe you are the mark. This is a common mistake the arrogant make. They underestimate the quiet ones. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. We will not be filing a lawsuit. That is reactive. That is what victims do. We, Mr. Miller, are going to construct a trap. He turned back, a thin, predatory smile gracing his lips for the first time. We are going to let them think their plan is working. We will prepare a counteroffer, one that appears to give them everything they want. It will be a beautiful document, full of legal loopholes and self-incriminating clauses that they, in their greed, will be blind to. We will let them sign the contract that will become the instrument of their own destruction. Thorne walked back to his desk and picked up his phone, his eyes gleaming with intellectual bloodlust. They want to steal your authenticity narrative and your bakery. Fine. We're going to make sure that by the time this is over, it's the only thing they have left. The next few days were a masterclass in the architecture of vengeance. Working out of a temporary office Cyrus Thorne had arranged for him, Henry was transformed. He was no longer a baker working with yeast and flour, but a strategist working with lawyers and financial analysts. He was astounded by the speed and precision of Thorne's operation. A team of forensic accountants, far more skilled than the ones Preston had hired, began a deep dive into Preston's venture capital firm, searching for the shell companies and financial vulnerabilities that Thorne called the cracks in the armor. Simultaneously, Henry worked with a different team to build his own future. He legally established a new parent company, Hearthstone Holdings, the name a private, bitter joke. He filed patents for his family's recipes and trademarked the bakery's name and branding, creating the very legal protections Blair and Preston had planned to exploit. He felt a detached, clinical focus, as if he were observing his own life from a great distance. The grief was still there, a cold, hard knot in his chest, but it was now a fuel source powering a relentless machine. The centerpiece of their strategy was the counter-proposal. Thorne and his team had drafted a work of legal genius. It appeared to be the desperate capitulation of a financially struggling baker, agreeing to the lifeline investment, but with a few sentimental clauses of his own. These clauses, buried in dense legalese, were the teeth of the trap. requiring full financial disclosure from Preston's firm and linking the deal to warranties of ethical conduct that they would immediately violate. The final step was the bait. Henry sat before a new encrypted laptop and, following Thorne's precise instructions, composed an email to Blair from a newly created anonymous account. It was short and seemingly desperate. "I know about your plan to invest," it read. "I can't fight you. Let's talk. I'm willing to sign." He pressed send, the click of the mouse sounding like a trigger being pulled in the silent room. A single quiet shot fired to begin a war they had no idea was already lost. The email felt like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards with silent, inevitable force. The response came faster than Henry or Thorne had anticipated, a testament to their rapacious hunger. It arrived not from Blair, but from an assistant to a man named Marcus Vance, senior partner at a prestigious and notoriously aggressive law firm. They wanted a meeting, not in a neutral boardroom, but at the bakery itself. The request was a power play, a deliberate choice to conduct the execution on Henry's own ground, to make him feel the full weight of his defeat in the place that defined him. Henry agreed without hesitation. The morning of the meeting, he worked as he always did, the pre-dawn ritual a calming balm against the cold knot of anticipation in his gut. He kneaded dough, shaped loaves, and filled the small space with the honest, life-affirming scent of baking bread. When they arrived, exactly at 10 a.m., it was as if a different species had entered his ecosystem. Preston was first, dressed in a cashmere sweater and tailored trousers that probably cost more than the bakery's monthly profit. He looked around the small shop, not with interest, but with the detached gaze of a developer assessing a tear-down property. Behind him was Blair, her face a perfect mask of serene triumph, her expensive trenchcoat a stark beige armor against the flour-dusted reality of the room. And with them was Marcus Vance, a man whose smile was as thin and sharp as a paper cut. They brought with them the scent of money, of expensive leather from Vance's briefcase, and a chilling aura of absolute certainty. They believed they were here to finalize a simple acquisition from a broken man, a final, merciful kill, never once suspecting they had just walked, willingly and eagerly, into the abattoir. Preston took the lead, his voice a smooth, condescending purr that was designed to sound reasonable, even kind. He leaned against the main counter, a casual posture that was a calculated act of ownership, his hand resting near a basket of still warm brioche, as if it were already his property. He spoke of synergy and unlocking dormant value, using a lexicon of corporate jargon that was utterly alien in this space of simple, tangible things. He gestured vaguely at the old brick oven, the heart of the bakery, and spoke of scaling the brand narrative into a chain of soulless, high-end cafes. "We see this as a partnership, Henry," he said, the lie so blatant it was almost impressive. "We're providing the capital and the vision to take what your family built and elevate it to its full potential. You should be proud." Henry's gaze drifted from Preston's self-satisfied face to Blair. She stood slightly behind him, a supportive, silent partner, her eyes gleaming with a vindicated light. This was her victory lap. This was the moment that proved she had made the right choice, that trading up from a simple baker to a venture capitalist was the correct, logical move. There was no flicker of doubt in her eyes, no trace of remorse for the man whose heart she had shattered and whose legacy she was now helping to dismantle. She looked at him with a cool, detached pity that was far more insulting than any anger could ever be. He felt the last lingering ghost of his love for her turn to dust and blow away, leaving behind only the cold, clear mechanics of the trap he was about to spring. Marcus Vance stepped forward, his movements precise and economical. He placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the counter, the sound a soft, expensive thud against the worn wood. He opened it to reveal the contract, its pages a pristine, intimidating white. "It's all very straightforward," Vance said, his voice as dry as old paper. "Our offer stands. $100,000 for a 75% controlling interest with the property deed and all intellectual property, including family recipes and branding, signed over to our holding company as collateral. He slid the document and a heavy gold-plated fountain pen across the counter. Henry looked down at the pages, the ones Cyrus Thorne had mocked up to look almost identical to their original proposal. He could feel their collective gaze on him, a palpable weight of expectation. They were waiting for him to hesitate, to argue, to show some final, pathetic flicker of resistance. He did none of those things. He picked up the pen, its weight unfamiliar and cold in his calloused hand. He thought of his grandfather, of the legacy of hidden strength passed down through generations. He thought of the insult, "Diamonds, not raisins," and a cold, hard calm settled over him. He uncapped the pen, the click echoing in the suddenly silent bakery. He looked directly at Blair, holding her triumphant gaze for a single long moment before he lowered his eyes to the signature line, a silent promise that the name he was about to write would be the one she would curse for the rest of her life. He signed his name with a steady, deliberate hand. The ink, a dark, rich blue, flowed onto the page, a stark, final mark. He signed the asset transfer agreement. He signed the irrevocable deed to the building his family had owned for a century. He signed the clause relinquishing all rights to the Miller's Hearth name and its associated proprietary formulas. With each signature, he could feel the atmosphere in the room shift. The predatory tension dissolved, replaced by a palpable wave of relief and smug satisfaction from the other side of the counter. Preston's shoulders relaxed, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. Vance gathered the pages with an air of crisp finality, a job cleanly and efficiently done. Blair let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh, the sound of a long-held anxiety finally being released. She had won. She had escaped the world of flower and early mornings and secured her place in the world of rooftop bars and venture capital. Henry pushed his copy of the contract aside and looked at the three of them, his face a carefully constructed mask of resigned defeat. He had given them everything they wanted. He had played the part of the beaten man to perfection. Preston, in a final act of condescending magnanimity, slid a single check across the counter. "No hard feelings, Henry," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "It's just business." Henry watched them turn and walk out of his bakery, their triumphant footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor, leaving him alone in the quiet, flower-scented air, with a check for $100,000 and a signed contract that had just given him legal ownership of their entire world. The air backstage was a pressurized mix of stale coffee, hairspray, and the electric tang of raw anticipation. It was a world away from the honest, yeasty warmth of his bakery, a sterile and artificial environment that made Henry's skin crawl. The suit he wore, a bespoke creation by a tailor Cyrus Thorne had on retainer, felt less like clothing and more like a perfectly weighted suit of armor. The dark wool was smooth and cool under his fingertips, a stark contrast to the familiar, comforting grit of flour that usually dusted his hands. He stood in the wings, a ghost in the machine of the evening, watching the event unfold on a series of small monitors. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a glittering galaxy of the city's elite, a swirling constellation of old money and new ambition. He saw them all, the venture capitalists, the art dealers, the fashion moguls, their faces animated in the warm, champagne-fueled glow. And then he saw them. The monitor zoomed in on a table near the front, and there they were, Preston and Blair, looking every bit the power couple they so desperately aspired to be. Preston was leaning in, his hand possessively on the back of Blair's chair, his expression one of smug ownership. Blair was radiant, her smile a carefully calibrated instrument of social climbing, her eyes scanning the room, assessing, networking, completely oblivious. They looked so certain, so untouchable in their shared arrogance. A cold, quiet calm settled deep in Henry's bones. This wasn't about the pain anymore. The raw, jagged wound of her betrayal had scarred over, leaving behind something harder, something forged in the fires of meticulous, calculated justice. A stage manager with a headset touched his elbow. 5 minutes, Mr. Miller. He nodded, his gaze fixed on their laughing faces on the screen. He was about to walk into the light and reveal a truth that would plunge their entire world into an inescapable, permanent darkness. He walked onto the stage, and a wave of polite, expectant silence washed over the ballroom. The heat of the spotlights was intense, a physical pressure against his face and chest, but his hands were steady as he gripped the sides of the lectern. For a moment, he just looked out at the sea of faces, 1,000 points of glittering jewelry and curious eyes. He found them immediately. Preston's expression was one of mild, condescending curiosity, while Blair's face was a canvas of pure, uncomprehending confusion. She squinted, her head tilting slightly as if trying to place the familiar face of the baker in this impossibly luxurious context. Henry leaned into the microphone, and his voice, calm and steady, filled the vast, silent room. "Good evening," he began. "My name is Henry Miller, and I'd like to tell you a story about a family recipe." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. On the massive screen behind him, an image appeared, the dark, dense, unapologetically humble fruitcake sitting in its hand-carved wooden box. From his vantage point, he saw Blair physically recoil, a flicker of embarrassment and disgust crossing her features. He saw her whisper something to Preston, a small, cruel smile on her lips. "This recipe," Henry continued, his voice resonating with a new authority, "was my great-grandfather's way of protecting his life's work. He was a prospector, you see, a man who pulled treasures from the earth. He learned that the most valuable things are often hidden in the most humble of wrappings." As he spoke, the image on the screen began to slowly, almost imperceptibly dissolve. The dark crumb of the cake faded, revealing the rough, uncut gemstones within, their deep, internal fires beginning to glow. The crowd let out a collective, audible gasp. Preston's jaw went slack, his eyes widening in dawning, horrified comprehension. But it was Blair's face that held Henry's attention. Her smug smile froze, then shattered, replaced by a mask of sickening, white-faced shock as the final image solidified on the screen. A gemological certificate for a single, flawless ruby with a valuation that contained 8 zeros. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this. The final image on the screen was the centerpiece of his new collection, the Astoria Legacy, a breathtaking necklace where the largest of the rubies, now cut to perfection, burned like a captured star. "This collection," Henry said, his voice ringing with a final, quiet finality, his eyes finding Blair's in the crowd, "is dedicated to the most valuable lesson I ever learned. Never throw away a gift made with love. You never know what kind of treasure you're despising." The event cameras, directed by a professional crew Thorne had hired for this exact purpose, swiveled and zoomed, finding Blair's face in the crowd and projecting it onto the secondary screens flanking the stage. There was nowhere for her to hide. The entire room, the entire world she had fought so desperately to enter, was now a witness to her humiliation. Her face, stripped of its curated poise, was a grotesque mask of pure, nauseating regret. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The realization hit her not as a thought, but as a physical, full-body cataclysm. Preston beside her didn't reach for her hand or offer a single word of comfort. His face was a thundercloud of cold, reptilian fury. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a glamorous partner but a fool, an idiot of historic proportions who had fumbled a connection to a real, self-made dynasty. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, turned his back on her without a single glance, and strode away, leaving her utterly, completely alone in the merciless glare of 1,000 judgmental eyes. Her curated world had not just cracked, it had been atomized, and she was left weeping in the radioactive fallout of her own greed. The true measure of wealth isn't found in a bank statement or a stock portfolio, but in the things that cannot be bought: loyalty, integrity, and the wisdom to recognize value when it doesn't glitter. Henry's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, and true power lies not in what you can acquire, but in what you refuse to sacrifice. What do you believe is the most valuable hidden treasure in life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 6 months had passed, and the bitter chill of that night had given way to the gentle, life-affirming warmth of a queen's spring. The world outside Henry's window was bursting with a vibrant, almost defiant green, a stark contrast to the grey landscape of his memory. He stood not in his small, cramped apartment, but in the newly expanded heart of the miller's hearth. He had used a small, carefully allocated portion of his newfound capital, not to escape his life, but to enrich it, to honor it. The bakery was now twice its original size, having absorbed the vacant storefront next door. Sunlight streamed through new floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the warm brick walls and gleaming copper fixtures. Yet at the center of it all, scarred and steadfast, was his grandfather's original wooden work table. It was here that he still began his mornings, his hands moving through the familiar, meditative rhythm of kneading dough. The air was a symphony of smells: the sharp, tangy scent of his sourdough starter, the rich aroma of single-origin coffee from the new espresso bar, and the sweet, buttery perfume of croissants cooling on a rack. The low hum of the old proofing cabinet was now joined by the quiet murmur of happy customers and the gentle clinking of porcelain. The gnawing anxiety that had once been his constant companion, the fear of a failed invoice or a broken oven, was gone. In its place was a profound, unshakable peace. He had not abandoned his craft. He had fortified it, building a kingdom of simple, honest quality. He was shaping a loaf of dark rye, his fingers pressing into the cool, pliant dough, when a young woman from his staff approached, holding a stiff, cream-colored envelope. It had been delivered by a courier, she said. He wiped his floured hands on his apron, a gesture as natural as breathing, and took the letter. The paper was thick and expensive, the return address embossed in the corner belonging to a legal firm he didn't recognize, one specializing in bankruptcy proceedings. A cold ghost of the past brushed against his newfound peace, a reminder that some stories have endings that arrive long after the final chapter is written. He slit the envelope open with a palette knife, the thin blade slicing cleanly through the heavy paper. The document inside was not a threat or a summons, but a notification. It was a copy of a bankruptcy petition filed by one Blair Caldwell. He scanned the pages, his mind detached, clinical, as if reading about a stranger. The petition was a stark, brutal inventory of a collapsed life. Her listed assets were a tragic parody of her aspirations: a handful of designer handbags with a resale value in the low hundreds, a 2018 model MacBook with a cracked screen, and a savings account containing less than $200. Her address was no longer in Soho or the Upper East Side, but a small third-floor walk-up in the farthest reaches of the Bronx. A small, attached note from Cyrus Thorne's office explained the final, quiet move in their strategy. The contract she and Preston had so eagerly signed contained clauses that made them personally liable for fraudulent misrepresentation. When Thorne's legal assault had systematically dismantled Preston's firm, a default judgment had been won against Blair for her role in the conspiracy. It was an unpayable debt that had finally crushed her. Henry felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying sting of revenge. There was only a profound and hollow sadness. He pictured her in that small, lonely room, surrounded by the worthless artifacts of a life she had tried to build on a foundation of pure illusion. He looked up from the paper, his gaze sweeping over his own world, The warm sunlight, the laughing customers, the honest, life-giving scent of baking bread. He had been surrounded by treasure his entire life and had never known it. The rubies and sapphires were just a fortunate footnote. The real inheritance was the work itself, the legacy of craft and community. He crumpled the notice in his hand, the legal jargon turning to meaningless paper, and tossed it into the recycling bin. He returned to his table, his hands finding the waiting loaf of rye, and as he shaped it with a final loving touch, he realized she had been right about one thing all along. He would always choose the raisins because he finally understood they had been the diamonds all along.